Okay, so now we've done a lot of discussing of psychological egoism, and the two different versions that you find in the history of philosophy. One kind of egoist philosopher trying to establish the ordinary rules of morality on a foundation of egoism via the social contract. Another trying to show that the traditional rules of morality limit the true expression of human potentiality, of potential and potentiality. So now you might be wondering, well, gee, there's a lot writing on this. So what are we to make of egoism? Is it true or not? And so we'll briefly look at the arguments which have been given for and against psychological and ethical egoism, and we'll see if we can make some sense of what's going on here. So here's one very famous argument, which basically goes like this. Look, anything that you do, it's something that you want to do. Now, intuitively, you might say, wait a minute, there's got to be some cases where I do something that I don't want to do. So, for instance, if I really don't want to come to class on a certain day, I'd rather stay at home. Nonetheless, I may go to class. Well, the response here is, no, actually, in some sense, you must have wanted to go to class. Sure, you may have wanted to stay at home as well, but you also must, in some sense, have wanted to come to class, even if that's only because you wanted to get the grade so that you could get a degree. If you want to get a degree, and in order to get that, you need to go to the course, then in some sense, you do want to go to the course, go to the class. So the fact that you went is, again, just showing that you're doing what you wanted to do. You want to take the class. You want to pass it. You want to get the grade because you want to get the degree. So even in this case, when you say, I wasn't doing something I wanted to do, really, if you think about it, you were ultimately doing something that you wanted. Now, even if you think, well, wait a minute, what about a person who sacrifices themselves? Say, for instance, volunteering to be the sober driver for their group of friends on a birthday so that their friends will be safe and have a good time. You may say, well, isn't that unselfish? They're not doing what they want there. They perhaps maybe want to be drinking, hanging out with their friends. Well, the argument here again is, no, they must, in some sense, again, want to be the designated driver. That's why they volunteered. Maybe they also want to be hanging out, but they want their friends to have a good time. They want things to be safe. And so in some sense, they do want to be the designated driver. So really, they're doing what they want. And in fact, there is some kind of intuitive claim to this idea. That is, to the idea that we do the things that we want to do. And of course, that's exactly the kind of thing that the compatibilist, who we were speaking about previously, bases their case for free will. So the things that you're acting freely when you do the things that you want to do, where those wants are caused by internal states of the person. And even in cases where someone puts a gun to your head and says, give me your money, you may in some sense want to give them the money since you want to preserve your life, but that want is being caused by something external to you in an inappropriate way, and so that action doesn't count as free. So they can agree that in this sense, that with the psychological egoist, that all of the actions that we do are ones that we want to do, even though some of them are free and some of them aren't free as per their compatibilism. Now, the conclusion of this argument is supposed to be that egoism is true, and that's because doing what one wants to do is acting selfishly. So they conclude all actions are selfish because all actions ultimately are done because you wanted to do them. Now, Rachels argues that this argument is no good. And the first thing he points out is that there do seem to be sometimes cases where we do things that we don't want to do. For example, you may keep a promise even though you don't want to keep the promise. Now again, remember that the egoist is simply going to argue that you did want to keep the promise. Otherwise, you wouldn't have kept it. So there must have been some sense in which you wanted to keep the promise. Even if it's true that there's a sense in which you didn't want to keep the promise, it's still the case that the thing that you wanted more is the thing that you did. You must have wanted to keep the promise more than you wanted not to keep it. So the argument is going to go. But even if we grant that point, the argument doesn't go through, because even if it's true, so suppose that someone agreed that all of our actions are motivated by something that we want to do. Someone could still deny that one's actions being motivated in that way meant that one's actions were selfish. So here's what Rachel's argument is. What makes an action selfish or not is not the fact that one does it because one wants to, but rather what it is that one wants to do, the thing that one wants to do. So if I want to keep my promises, and that's the reason I do something, that doesn't seem selfish. That seems like a good person, because this person wants an appropriate thing. Namely, they want to keep their promises. Whereas someone who wanted to spend all their money, all their rent money, on alcohol instead of the rent, clearly isn't wanting something that's appropriate. The fact that I want to keep my promise shows that I am not acting selfishly. I'm not merely trying to promote my own self-interest. Or at least it's not obvious that I'm trying to promote my own self-interest, since what I want to do in this case is to keep a promise. That's in fact what we call a good person. So Rachel's point here is, even if it's true that everything we do is something that we want to do, it still doesn't automatically follow. You need some further kind of argument to establish that everyone's acting selfishly, because we could define selfish and non-selfish actions in terms of the things that people want, as opposed to merely them wanting things. So it's whether you want to throw yourself a party with your rent money or you want to be responsible that determines whether you're acting selfishly or not. And this is similar to the kind of argument that Ayn Rand was making with respect to her version of egoism. So it's true that both of the person who robs and steals does what they want and acts in what they think is their self-interest, whereas the person who works hard, has friends, it is honest and so on, also acts in their self-interest. But it doesn't follow that they're both acting in what she would call rational self-interest, since the person who's stealing and thieving and so on doesn't realize that what's really in their self-interest is this pure expression of their individuality and their own self-worth, and so they don't realize themselves as the kind of person who doesn't need to steal. So we can still make these kinds of judgments, even though she thinks everyone ought to act in their own self-interest. Not all everyone's perceived actions, it's not the case that if someone perceives something to be in their self-interest, that means that it really is in their self-interest. And so here what Rachel's is claiming is not exactly the same thing, but it's something related, namely that whether we want to act in our own self-interest or whether we're wanting to act because of some moral reason makes a difference. So if you want to keep a promise, then that seems like a good thing. So the fact that your action is caused by that wanting doesn't strike Rachel's as a reason for saying that the action was selfish. Okay, so and this a very closely related second argument claims that all actions are selfish because they are always produced by a sense of satisfaction in the person. So, for instance, when you tell the truth, you get a good feeling. When you donate to charity, you feel good about yourself. When you lie, you feel bad about yourself. When you cheat on your husband, you feel bad about yourself. So really, these actions, which we think are so moral, people telling the truth or avoiding adultery and so on, we think that these are moral actions, unselfish actions. Well, the argument goes, these are actually selfish because you're just acting in order to get this pleasure or to avoid the pain. And this was a very famous argument given by Abraham Lincoln. So it was reported that Lincoln was riding in the carriage with his friend. They were having a debate about whether we ever act unselfishly. So whether they were debating whether psychological egoism was true or not. And Lincoln thought that psychological egoism was true. His friend didn't. So they were driving along having this debate. And then as they were driving, there was this squirrel on the side of the road, which was clearly injured. And Abraham Lincoln calls to the driver of the carriage, pull over at once. They pull over, he springs out from the carriage, runs to the aid of the squirrel, administers CPR to it. No, just kidding. But he tends to the wounds of the squirrel, makes sure that it's okay. He gets back into the carriage and his friend seizes upon him. Aha, Abe, you see how you sprung to the aid of that squirrel without a moment's thought for yourself. That's what I mean by an unselfish act. And they exist, you just proved it. Well, Abe said, no, not quite. That was actually a very selfish act, because if I had not helped that poor squirrel, I would not have been able to sleep at all this coming night. So Abe's point was that he was really motivated not by trying to get some pleasure for helping the squirrel, but he was trying to avoid a sense of discomfort from not helping the squirrel. So he didn't want to be up all night thinking, oh, I should have done something for that poor squirrel. So he's really acting selfishly because he's trying to avoid this discomfort. So this, again, the conclusion is supposed to be that since we're always trying to get this pleasure or avoid this discomfort, and we'll see this again when we come to utilitarianism towards the end of the course. So the idea then is that, well, all our actions are selfish because ultimately we're just trying to, even when we're keeping our promises and acting what people would think is unselfishly, we're just trying to avoid this discomfort. Now, again, Rachels objects to this argument, and he objects to this argument for, he objects to this argument for the very same reason that he objected to the previous argument, and that's because getting pleasure from keeping your promises seems like a good thing. In fact, we call the people who get pleasure from keeping their promises good people, and people who get pleasure from breaking their promises or from hurting innocent people, we call those bad people. So Rachels thinks that whether you get pleasure from an action or not is just irrelevant to whether the action is selfish or not. What's important is what kinds of things you get pleasure from. So if you get pleasure from helping people, that's what we mean by calling a person unselfish. If you get pleasure from donating to charity, working, volunteering your time, helping those less fortunate, that's exactly what we mean by a non-selfish person. The fact that they derive pleasure from it, Rachels argues, doesn't seem to really show that they're being selfish. So both of these arguments for psychological egoism don't hold up. Now, in fact, there's a second argument we can briefly note here when thinking about the relationship of pleasure and acting morally. So it's not exactly clear what the relationship is supposed to be. So say you keep your promise and that makes you feel good. Well, why does keeping your promise make you feel good? Well, excuse me. Suppose that you keep your promises and you also feel good about keeping your promises. It's not obvious that it immediately follows that you kept your promise in order to feel good about keeping it. So it certainly seems at least plausible or possible that you kept your promise and felt good about it, but maybe you kept your promise because you thought you had a duty to keep your promise, and that just happened to also make you feel good about yourself. But you really were motivated in acting by recognizing that you should keep your promises, or in other words, by recognizing the role that promise keeping plays. Now, that's an idea that we'll come back to later when we're talking about Kant. So, psychological egoism doesn't seem to be forced on us, even if it's true that we always do what we want. So, even if you're a compatibilist, you can still make a distinction between selfish actions and unselfish actions, even if you think that all of our actions are done in order to get pleasure or avoid pain. So, even if you're something like what we'll find out later we'll call psychological hedonism. So even if you think a claim like that is true, you can still make distinctions between selfish actions and unselfish actions. So it doesn't follow that egoism is true, that all of our actions are selfish, or that we ought to always be only looking out for our own self-interest. Now, something else that we can say about this relationship of satisfaction to the motivation for action is that unless you really wanted to help others, it doesn't seem as though you would get pleasure from helping others. So the fact that you get pleasure from helping others seems to be the result of actually genuinely wanting to help others and accomplishing what you want to do, not simply the reason for your action. So again, if that's the case, and if it's the case that wanting to help others is not something that's in itself selfish, then we haven't found any reason for thinking that psychological egoism is forced on us. So no reason for thinking that is true. All right, now what about ethical egoism? Should we think that ethical egoism is true? Well, Rachels gives two arguments against ethical egoism. One of them is that it results in something like a contradiction. So the ethical egoist doesn't seem to be able to tell other people about their views. So again, think about the ethical egoist, what their position is. Their position is that it's a universal moral rule which is binding on all human beings, that all their actions ought to promote that person's rational self-interest. Now think about the kind of world in which the egoist is going to do best. Suppose that you want your self-interest maximized. Think of two situations here. One, the egoist lives in a world where no one else is an egoist. Everyone else thinks they ought to help other people, they ought to sacrifice their own self-interest for the interest of other people's, and so on. Now, that's one situation. Or the other situation where the egoist lives in a world where everyone is an egoist and everyone is only looking out to promote their own self-interest. What's the better world for an egoist? Well, Rachels argues it's the first one, the one where no one else is an egoist. That's the kind of world where the egoist will do best. So that's the kind of world that the egoist should strive to promote. But at the same time, the egoist holds that egoism is a universal moral rule. And of course, if it's a universal moral rule, all people should hold it. So the egoist seems duty-bound to promote egoism, to tell other people that they ought to be egoists as well, since they're all acting immorally, and the egoist ought to inform them that they're acting immorally. But they can't do that without violating something which seems to be in their best interest. So the very act of telling other people, which they seem to have a duty to do, seems to violate their duties of promoting their own self-interest. So there seems to be a contradiction here. Okay, so sorry, that's what I just said. Now, secondly, egoism just seems cold and calculating. So Rachel just says, look, think about the person who is an egoist, and this person is, for instance, pushing a small child out of the way of an oncoming car. Now think again, Rachel says, about why they're doing that. Well, the egoist is only doing that because they've calculated that somehow it promotes their own interest. They wouldn't have done it if it wasn't in their own interest. In fact, they would have said it would have been immoral to do it if somehow it hadn't been in their own self-interest to save that child from the oncoming bus. But Rachel says, look, that doesn't even seem like a moral theory. It seems so cold and calculating, because traditionally, or sort of pre-theoretically, it would seem that you should have saved the kid whether it was in your interest or not. Now, that's not so much of an argument against egoism as it is a moral condemnation of ethical egoism. And so whether that carries a lot of weight or not will depend on how you already feel about egoism. So this argument, this last one we're considering here, doesn't carry all that much weight against the egoist, but the contradiction one is something that the egoist has to contend with. It does seem as though their view entails this kind of contradiction. Okay, so what are we to make of this social contract theory? It's very, very nice in that what it allows, or seemingly allows, egoists to do is to endorse the standard rules of morality. One should keep their promises, one should donate to charity, one should turn the other cheek, and so on and so on. Even if there is no God, Hobbes was an atheist. He thought that we were here on our own, that this morality wasn't part of the natural world, but it's created by us as a way to further something which we're all keenly interested in, our own self-interests. But there is an obvious problem with this line of argument, and that's that the egoist is doing this all and only because it's in their self-interest. So that's what we were just talking about with respect to Rachel's last argument for ethical egoism. That may not be a knockdown argument, but it does open up a problem. If these people could get away, the egoist that is, if the ethical egoists could get away with breaking the rules, then they would. So imagine someone who's only following the rules of society because they've calculated that it's in their best interest to do so. Well, this person will also have calculated that if they can break the rules without getting caught, and breaking the rules promotes their best interests, and there's no fear of getting caught, then they should break those rules. Now, this is what the Ring of Gyges is supposed to illustrate in that famous dialogue from Plato. So the Ring of Gyges is a mythical ring that turns the person invisible. And we're supposed to imagine a person who's an upright citizen, someone who pays their taxes, and performs all their duties and tells the truth and so on, obeys all the conventions of morality. And then this person discovers the Ring of Gyges and they realize that they can put it on and become invisible. So we're to imagine, well, what's this person going to do if they could be invisible at will? When they put the ring on, are they simply going to go about their normal habits of telling the truth, keeping their promises, obeying the rules of morality? Or do we think that once they've determined that they really can put this ring on and get away with stuff, are they going to start breaking those rules? They're going to start taking things when they want to, stealing, they're going to start robbing. Who knows what else they're going to do? So in movie form, this idea has been dramatized in a movie with Kevin Bacon. So you may remember there's this movie where Kevin Bacon becomes invisible because of some experiment, and he starts stalking this woman who he's always had some kind of estranged, complicated relationship with. He's spying on her, going into her room, looking at her when she doesn't know he's there, and so on. And it culminates with him raping her. Now, this I'm not saying is typical, but it illustrates the point that the Ring of Gyges is trying to get across, or this thought experiment is trying to get across, namely that you take an ordinary person who seems like a good person, and you give them the chance to break the rules of society, they jump on it. Now, why is this a problem for social contract theory? Because it reveals how tenuous the rules of morality really are. And people, it seems, have an intuition that even if you could get away with it, you still ought not to steal. And if that's correct, if this really captures a fact about the way we think morality is, then social contract theory and the egoism on which it's founded don't really seem to be capturing what it is that we mean or are trying to capture with our set of moral rules. So think about the clash here in a concrete case. So suppose that you're an egoist. Suppose that, let's say, you are on your way to a job interview and you've lost your wallet and you need some money to get on the subway to buy a Metro card. But you've lost your wallet. Now you need to make it to this interview. So you're walking down a street. It's deserted. There's no one around. You see in someone's car a $20 bill sitting on the dashboard. Now you look around. The street is deserted. Imagine it's sort of in an industrial area. So there's no one around. It's not nighttime or anything, but there's just no one around. It's you can see down the street for a fair way, and there's nobody coming. There's not a lot of traffic. There's nobody in windows. It's all this industrial area. There's the money. The windows rolled down. The money's on the dashboard. There's no chance that you're going to get caught. So what does the egoist do? In this situation, it seems like they take the money. Well, it seems like they ought to take the money. That's what's in their best interest. Even though the rules of morality determine that they ought not to take it, let's say, egoism says that they should. Now, if that's true, if that's right, that the rules of morality then don't seem to be the kinds of things which you can opt out of, if that's the case, then this whole social contract approach doesn't seem to be right, since it says these things are arbitrarily made up by us. But when we think about rules against rape, against thievery, against all manner of immoral killings and so on, they don't seem to be merely conventions to help us get along. Or at least that's the point that the Ring of Gyges is meant to illustrate. We have the intuition that the person still should be bound by the rules of morality, even though they could get away with it. That doesn't mean that they should do it. Now, finally then, let's talk about a little bit another way of illustrating this point of that social contract theory doesn't seem to be able to really capture what it is we mean when we talk about obligations or moral responsibility. So think again about the social contract theory. What is it doing? It's being offered up as a way to try to explain how morality arises in a natural way. So it's a way of answering the no foundation argument. Where does the authority of morality come from? It comes from the authority of self-interest. We all act in self-interest, and morality then is the best way to promote our self-interest. Think about the state of nature. According to the egoist, there's no such thing as right or wrong in the state of nature. There are no moral obligations at all in the state of nature. But if this is the case, then how can the social contract be a morally binding contract? When you enter the social contract, you are in the state of nature and no obligations exist. So you say, I promise to obey the social contract. Have you created an obligation to obey the contract? Well, no, not unless other people honor their agreement as well. So if there is no morality in the state of nature, if there really is no such thing as it being wrong to break a promise, then when you enter the social contract and you break the rules of morality, you still haven't done anything wrong. Other people may judge it to be wrong, but if you don't get caught, it's not really wrong. Well, now, if you think that something about this story that I was just telling sounds fishy, no, it would really be wrong because the promise you made is a morally binding promise. What is it about that promise which is morally binding? It's got to be something which you were capable of doing in the state of nature. Well, if that's the case, then the social contract can't be the origination of morality. There's got to be something which is prior, which could exist in the state of nature, which is the foundation for morality. Now, interestingly, that's what the social contract theorist John Locke thought, something like that. He thought, well, in the state of nature, there was already morality. We could already say that certain things were right or wrong, even if there were no government. Now, that's, of course, because Locke thought that the laws of God established morality, and that's the thing that we'll be turning to next. Notice that social contract theory and egoism are typical ways of atheists or non-religious persons of grounding morality in a purely naturalistic, non-supernatural way. But of course, there's a long tradition of people who try to ground the basis of morality in God's nature.